Okay, continuing on. Jesus returned to Galilee, so he has been baptized. He has been publicly marked out by John the Baptist, at least, if not by anyone else. We will read in John that several of Jesus' first disciples were originally John's disciples. And so when John identifies him as the Messiah from the anointing that he received at his baptism, that will actually be what causes a lot of Jesus' own initial disciples to start following him. So that's happened, and now he's gone off into the wilderness and back again. So he has returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. So he's been traveling around and making a name for himself. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, now John, in the Gospel of John, will record several other incidents that occur before Jesus returns to Galilee and begins his Galilean ministry. And it seems as though it was the arrest of John the Baptist which triggered Jesus to shift into his Galilean ministry mode. But it's hard to say for certain. At any rate, he went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written. Now, before we continue with this, we need to talk a little bit about the synagogues. We've heard about this a few times. We read about it a little bit. We've known from Matthew and Mark that Jesus did go to the synagogue. In Matthew 23, when he is condemning the Pharisees, he talks about them loving to sit in the chief places of importance in the synagogues. The synagogue was a concept that the Jews came up with, I think, on their own during and after the Babylonian exile, during the time when their temple was destroyed and they had no official means of worshiping God, because everything they did officially had to be done through the temple. And with no temple, how can you... And God didn't give them an answer, as far as I can tell. You read the later Old Testament books that take place in and around and after the exile, and it doesn't appear as though God ever explicitly tells them what he wants them to do in absence of a temple. I don't know if they prayed about it and got an answer from him, from a prophet or something, and that just isn't recorded, or if they came up with ideas on their own and he just kind of let them. I'm not really sure. Okay, the synagogue I cannot find anything anywhere in the Old Testament indicating that God ever told them to come up with a synagogue concept. Now, Jesus went to the synagogues, and the apostles did too. Paul would make that his default approach everywhere he went, was to go to the synagogue first. So, I guess there was nothing wrong with it. I mean, Jesus kind of tacitly endorses it by doing it, by going to the synagogue and participating in that. But it was not an officially authorized form of worship. But what they would do, and we would consider it today to be very much like a church service, because they met on the Sabbath, and they would go to this meeting place. It was an actual, meeting hall or whatever, and they would have an assembly there. I'm assuming we're talking men. I don't know if women were involved in this or not, frankly. If they were, they would have been sitting in their own area. It's possible they would have been present, but there would have been a dividing line where the men sat on one side and the women sat on the other side. But I'm not even sure if the women were there, frankly. And they would have had like a synagogue president. We've read about some of their synagogue rulers. We read about a couple of these guys before. And these people may not have been priests. Okay, the synagogue people, one of the things about the synagogues is that they weren't necessarily run by priests. During the exile period, there was no temple, so the priests couldn't function because all their functions were to be performed at the temple. And so they developed, it was customary for just laymen, and even the Pharisees, we talk about them all the time. They weren't a priestly class. Okay, now some of them may have been priests, some of them, but the Pharisees are mainly laymen. They were non-priests who took the word, the scriptures, the Old Testament law, the Torah, very seriously, and let everyone else take it very seriously too. But they were generally not priests. The priestly class was mainly the Sadducees, and they would have had like the religious authority. The Pharisees did not actually have any authority. They were a pressure group. You could think of them today as basically being like an activist group. And so therefore they were mainly not priests. Now there may have been some legitimate, genuine, faithful, devout priests who were also Pharisees, but for the most part, the priests would have been in the Sadducee class or group, and the Pharisees would have been laymen. And so, in the synagogues, there may have been priests in the synagogue. The priests didn't always live in Jerusalem. I read about Zechariah earlier in the book, in the beginning of Luke, and we read about how there were these priestly divisions where they would go for a couple of weeks to take care of it. That goes back to David's prescription for the temple worship at the end of First Chronicles. And they would go to the priests at the temple. There were 24 divisions of priests, and they would go to the temple for a couple of weeks at a time, and then they would go back home. They didn't even live in Jerusalem. They lived out, in the countryside, and they would just take these turns, these shifts, where they would go to the temple and do their duties for a period of time, 2 weeks, I believe it was, and then they would go back home. That's what Zechariah was doing when he was on his duty at the temple in the beginning of Luke. And so he may have been involved in his local synagogue. He probably was. So, there would have been faithful, devout priests who would have been involved in these. But the synagogues didn't have to have a priest connected to them. I think they probably would have preferred that. Okay, if Zechariah had a synagogue in his town, he probably was involved in it. And the synagogue people probably would have preferred to have a priest. But they didn't have to. And the speakers didn't always have to be priests either. In this case, Jesus is being given a chance to speak. I don't know how they determined this. It doesn't say whether or not he won a casting of the lot or what. I'm not sure. And I don't know exactly how they handle the readings either. Now, where I come from in my background is at a Lutheran church, we have a set, we would call it a lectionary, where we have a set list of readings that we follow because every week of the year is, they have a church year, and every week has like a certain theme to it or a focus. And they have like assigned readings for every week of the year. And I think it's every 3 years or so, you kind of complete the lectionary and you start over again. And in the process of doing that, you basically read through the Bible. It's not entirely the Bible, but that it's intended to kind of give you the content of the entire Bible by reading through the lectionary I think it's 3 years. And then they always actually. There's 4 kinds of readings in the services that I attended growing up and still do occasionally. There are 4 kinds of readings. There's an Old Testament reading that comes from somewhere in the Old Testament. That's not the Psalms, because there's also a Psalm reading. Then there is a New Testament reading that's not in the Gospels, because there's also a Gospel reading. All right. So you have Old Testament, then Psalm, which of course is part of the Old Testament. The Old Testament reading comes somewhere else. Then a Gospel reading, and then another New Testament reading. And the sermon is usually based on one of those 4 readings. And they usually tie together. It's usually, like I said, it's a prescribed list. So there usually is like a common theme that ties them together, these readings. And the sermon is nearly always kind of built out of one of those readings. And this is pretty much what they're doing here. The Lutherans modeled their approach after this. You have a reading, and I don't know if Jesus is picking up where they left off the previous week. Maybe. I guess he probably is. Because he's not picking the scroll of Isaiah. It's being handed to him. So I presume whoever read last week read the scroll of Isaiah, and Jesus is just kind of picking up where that guy left off. But I don't know that for sure. At any rate, so the guy speaking, which in this case is Jesus, would read from the scroll, and then he would talk about it. He would give some kind of lesson or discussion about it. And this person would be like the teacher of the week, so to speak, and everybody else would be standing listening to him. The speaker, the teacher, actually is the one sitting. We'll see. We've seen that before with Jesus in the other Gospels, and we'll see it again. But like the speaker is the one who gets to sit. Everybody else has to stand. So that's what's going on here. Jesus is, I don't know if it's his turn or if he just gets invited. I'm not entirely certain how that works. At any rate, he's going to speak. And so he's going to, they give him a scroll, I presume from where they left off reading previously. And he's going to continue reading from there, and then he's going to give some kind of lesson on it. And they don't know what he's going to say. Okay, it's like they're all there to hear what he's going to say. So, and he went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. And he stood up to read. So you stand to read, but he'll sit to teach. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me." There's that anointed word again. That's the basis of the term Messiah or Christ. "To preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." We'll go ahead and look at that section ourselves. That's Isaiah 61. We'll go ahead and read that near the end of the scroll, the book of Isaiah. Remember, they didn't have these kinds of books back then. They had scrolls, so you have to unroll it and find the spot. It would not be much longer before they started using these, and scrolls kind of hit the historical wayside. But we're not there yet. That's not going to really happen until just after the New Testament times. Actually, it'll be, the Christians will largely be responsible for popularizing these kinds of, this is called a codex. The Christians will be largely responsible for popularizing codices, these kinds of spine books that flip open, because it was easier. It was easier to open it up and carry it around and find your place and carry copies of them when they did their trips and their missionary journeys. But that won't be until basically after. During New Testament times, they're still writing on scrolls. Anyway, Isaiah 61, the very beginning of the chapter. "The Spirit of the Lord, sovereign Lord, is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God." Jesus doesn't read that. He cuts off there. He cuts off before he gets to that. Now, this whole section is kind of talking about their return from exile in the future. So Jesus is kind of quoting from a section of Isaiah that is, in the short term, talking about their return from exile in days gone by. In Jesus' day, that's already happened. And so he has a different interpretation in mind for this. To release the oppressed and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. But he cuts off before talking about the day of vengeance for our God. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. So now he's ready to teach. The sitting position is the teaching position. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. So they're there to listen to him. And he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So this is the year of the Lord's favor, as he speaks today. This is happening. He considers himself to be the one speaking in Isaiah. When he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord." So he's saying, I'm the one who's here to do this. That me, that I in the passage, is referring to me. I'm here, sitting here in front of you, and I'm going to do this. I am doing this. I'm doing this right now. That's how he begins. Now, we don't get anything else here from his speech. He apparently does deliver some kind of a sermon here, but we don't get anything from his sermon except that one line. Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. All, because something else happened that will kind of cut our attention to something else. All spoke well of him, and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? They said. Jesus said to them. So he is speaking. He is saying more. He does not finish his lesson just by saying this one sentence. He is going on and talking some more, to such a degree that the people in the crowd are beginning to ask themselves, don't we know this guy? Like, isn't he a local kid? Isn't he the son of the carpenter? Isn't he the tecton? Like, what, He's talking about himself as though he is this chosen, destined figure, but we know who this guy is. He's just a dude. He's just a carpenter. Jesus said to them, so whatever he had been saying is not recorded, and now he's going to say something else, because he can tell that they're getting disgruntled that a local boy is referring to himself in these great terms. And, I can understand that. Okay, just like I can understand why Jesus' brothers had a hard time believing in him until after his death and resurrection. Like, I have an older brother. Now he's almost 50 now, I'm in my 40s. If my older brother at age 30 had left the house and started talking about how he was the chosen one who's going to lead the world into this, like he's like this, I would have thought he was pretty cuckoo too. Okay? Alright. I can see why, or if some kid I went to school with had started doing that, I can see why it's like, huh? You? What are you talking about? I can totally understand their reaction. And I don't even think it's really wrong to have that reaction. What's wrong is what they're going to do next. Because Jesus is going to try to open their eyes, and they're not going to want their eyes to be opened. So Jesus said to them, surely you will quote this proverb to me. Physician, heal yourself. Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you have done at Capernaum. So he's already been to Capernaum. Again, Luke is not recording these events strictly in order. He has already begun doing miracles in other places and has developed a reputation for doing this. He did mention that a couple of verses ago at the beginning of this section. But Jesus has already gotten a reputation for being a miracle worker in other places. And now he's back in Nazareth, and so they're all interested in, like, this guy can perform miracles? I just saw him make a chair, or make a yoke for my oxen. It's like, huh? So it's like, okay, do some miracles for us then, local guy. But I tell you the truth, he continued, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that this is what's going to really anger them. Up until this point, they've been speaking very well of him. It's like, oh, okay. The hometown kid has grown up to be quite a guy. But this is what's going to make him mad. Now, they're not believing in him. They can't quite bring themselves to believe that he is this guy spoken of by Isaiah. But they are impressed and amazed at his ability to speak and reason. And they're proud. I mean, he's a local kid. He's a hometown guy. So they're pleased that he's making a name for himself as this miracle worker. But they don't really believe that he's the guy that Isaiah was talking about, or these other prophets are talking about. Like, that's just too hard for them to accept. But what's going to make him mad is what he's going to say next. I tell you the truth, he continued. No prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. But Elijah was not sent to any of them, but only to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon, to a non-Israelite, in other words. You read about that at the end of 1 Kings. 1 Kings 16, I think it is, 16 or 17. Elijah shut up the rain for 3.5 years, and then he went to go hide, initially by a brook, and then eventually he went out of the country to Sidon. And he met a widow there, a young widow probably, because she had a very young son, so she was probably a young woman herself. And she was about to die. She was gathering sticks to go use them to stir up her last little bit of flour and oil to make some bread, a small loaf of bread for herself and her son so they could eat it and then go sit off in a corner somewhere and die, wait to die. And Elijah went to go to them, and he stayed with them. And he saved them by providing them with resources that didn't run out. And they saved him by hiding him from Ahab and Jezebel. So and by the way, the king of that country was Jezebel's father. So he was in enemy territory, even though he had left Israel. And so they hid him, and he provided for them. Through his miraculous works, he kept their flour and oil full. But they were not Israelites, and Elijah was not sent to any of the Israelite widows, but to this one. But Elijah was not sent to any of them, but only to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. We can read about that in 2 Kings. Elisha is Elijah's successor as prophet, and he does a lot of miraculous works. In fact, he does even more miraculous works than Elijah did. And one of the things he did was to cleanse a Syrian general named Naaman of leprosy. And Naaman was working for an enemy nation that was causing a lot of trouble and distress for Israel because they were making war against them repeatedly. And he was this army commander was sick with leprosy, and he got healed by Elisha. Elisha healed an enemy commander whose king was directly responsible for inflicting considerable suffering on Israel. But Elisha healed him, but did not heal other lepers that were in Israel. So Jesus' point here is that the chosen people are not the only representatives of God's blessing. That proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor that he ended his reading with doesn't just mean the Israelites. And that's what's going to make him mad. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They do not want the Gentiles to share in their promised blessings. That is not what they want to hear. And this guy, this hometown hero, thinks he's the one who's here to bring these blessings, and yet he's telling them he's going to bring them to the Gentiles and not to them. That's going to drive him over the edge. So they're going to go throw him over the edge. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him down the cliff. They've had enough. That's all they want to hear is just this one thing, and that's it for them. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Now some people, I have in fact in the past, thought of this as sort of a miraculous walking, like he just kind of like phases through them. But I don't think that's the case anymore. The older I get, the more I think he probably just powered his way through them. There probably came a point where he just said enough is enough, and he just went right his way. Like I said, Jesus would have been a very physically powerful person. Whether he's a carpenter or especially a stonecutter, he would have been and he's 30 years old, so he's in basically the prime of life, and he would have been a very physically imposing individual. And I don't know how tall he was, but he would have been very huskily built. And so he could have very easily just powered his way through the crowd through his sheer presence. So I tend to think these days, as I get older, that he probably didn't just like miraculously phase through them like a ghost. I used to think that, because it kind of sounds like he walked right through them. Later on, he's going to walk through walls, walk on water. And we can just walk right through these people too. So as a kid growing up, I kind of thought that, but the older I get, the more I think probably not. Probably he just eventually just overpowered them and influenced and basically just stared them down and made them back down, and he just walked right through them and left.